Before we get into today's case, I want to thank the incredible game, Hero Wars, for sponsoring this video. It's been a year since I joined Hero Wars. On a summer's day, just like today, my faithful companions went to the forest and never returned. As it turned out, they were attacked by a bunch of accursed heroes, a red-headed she-fiend with a chain gun, a loyal priestess of light with a staff, a fiery demon with a reaper's sheath, and a ruthless knight clad in shining armour.
Oh my God, stop it! They're still just kids.
My servants fought with all they had, almost securing a victory. But all of a sudden, swords began raining down from the sky, shredding them to pieces. Watch this story unfold in Hero Wars. Join the game now and get a super chest with 5 top heroes. One of them is secret, as well as 600 emeralds and 30,000 gold. Scan this QR code or download the game from the link below. See you in Hero Wars. Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century. So sit back as we go to England. Sarah Jane Roberts was born on the 1st of March 1862 and lived in the parish of St Michael's in the town of Pembroke in South Wales. Her father was a respectable, hard-working member of the small community, but the family did not live in very favourable circumstances. So in 1878, Sarah Jane travelled to the English city of Manchester. Her brother was already working there, and Sarah Jane found employment in domestic service. At the time, it was very common for young women to enter domestic service once they had finished school, and Sarah Jane had no problem in securing herself a position. She was very charming, with an extremely pleasant demeanour, and was described by her employers as a well-mannered, hard-working and considerate young lady. In 1879, she was offered employment in the property of Mr. Richard Greenwood and his wife Mary Ann. They were a respectable couple who lived in comfortable circumstances in the Harper Hay area of Manchester. They were both in their 70s and were anxious to employ someone to help them around the house. Mr. Greenwood was in good health, although a little deaf, but his wife found walking difficult and would spend most of the day upstairs in her bedroom. Miss Sarah Jane Roberts was happy to take up the position as housekeeper, and she proved to be a great help to both Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood. As well as being very hard-working, she was also kind-hearted and honest, and soon gained the trust of her employer. She always seemed to be happy, and Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood grew very fond of their young housekeeper. They started to treat her more like a relative than a maid. Manchester had grown significantly since the start of the Industrial Revolution, as people came to the area to work in the many factories, especially in the wool, cotton and silk industries. By 1877, horse-drawn trams had been introduced in Salford, and in 1879, the tracks were being put down in Manchester. Sarah Jane would fetch Mr. Greenwood a newspaper on most days, and she liked to learn about the changes happening in Manchester and beyond. Fortunately, Mr. Greenwood would always comment about the things that had been reported in the press, and she often heard him talking about the important events that were happening, such as in December of 1879, when the newspapers reported that a young inventor named Thomas Edison had held the first public demonstration of his incandescent light bulb in a street in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Gentlemen sometimes called at the house to ask Miss Sarah Jane if she may like to go out with them on Sundays. She occasionally obliged of their requests and was sometimes seen walking in the park with a potential suitor. However, although she had many admirers, she did not have any one in particular, and she seemed to prefer to spend her days off in the house of Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood. On the 7th of January 1880, Mr. Greenwood's business partner, named Mr. William Cooper, called at the house. It was around midday. He knocked at the door, and Sarah Jane hurriedly made her way from the kitchen to open it. As Mr. Cooper entered the house, he noticed a letter lying on the floor. It had been hand-delivered, as it had no stamp. It must have been pushed under the door, as some had gone under the rug. He pointed it out to Sarah Jane, and asked her if it may be from an Amara. Sarah Jane picked up the letter, and saw that it was addressed to Mr. Greenwood. As she showed Mr. Cooper in, she took the letter with her, and gave it to her master. Mr. Greenwood opened it straight away, but was surprised by its contents. It read, "Mr. Greenwood, I want to take the land near the coal yard behind the druggist shop, Queen's Road. I will pay either monthly, quarterly or yearly, and will pay in advance. I will meet you tonight from 5 to 6 o'clock at the 3 Tons, corner of Chernut Street, and will tell you all particulars. I don't know your address, or would have posted it. Yours, W. Wilson, Oldham Road. Mr. Greenwood found it strange that the writer claimed not to have known his address, yet came to his house to hand-deliver the letter. He did own the piece of land in question, but had no immediate plans to sell or rent it. He thought that it would be best if he just ignored the letter. His wife, however, had other ideas. She told him that he should at least meet the person who had taken the trouble to inquire about the land. After all, he may make an offer that it would be impossible to refuse. Mr. Greenwood thought about this for a while, and then told his wife that he would indeed go and meet the mysterious gentleman. The 3 Tons public house was about a mile from his residence in Westbourne Grove, in Harperhay, so in the late afternoon, Mr. Greenwood left his home and made his way to the 3 Tons. When he arrived, he asked the landlord if anyone had been looking for him. The landlord replied that there had not. Mr. Greenwood then asked if the landlord knew of a gentleman by the name of Mr. W. Wilson, but again, the landlord was unable to help. Mr. Greenwood thought it quite strange that someone would put a note through his door, inquiring about a piece of land, and requesting that he meet them later that day, only for the person not to arrive. He waited for another 15 minutes and decided to return home. Before he did, he told the landlord that if the mysterious Mr. Wilson should turn up, he should be instructed to find him at his home in Westbourne Grove. As Mr. Greenwood came towards his house, he noticed that people were standing outside. They seemed to be intrigued, as some incident had taken place. There were also 2 policemen. The day had been very strange, and Mr. Greenwood wondered what could now have happened to make his house such a place of local curiosity. He was then stopped by the police officer and told of the terrible tragedy that had occurred during his absence. After Mr. Greenwood had left his house, the milkman named Mr. James Parlington had come by to deliver the milk. He had given this to Sarah Jane, who had placed it in the cupboard in the cellar. Mr. Parlington had then continued on his rounds. A short while later, Mrs. Greenwood, who was upstairs in her bedroom, heard a knock at the front door, and then heard it close again. The door was heavy, and it always made a loud thud when it was closed. Someone must have entered the house, as Mrs. Greenwood heard footsteps. They seemed to be soft, and she thought that the visitor was probably a female. However, she did wonder if there may actually have been 2 people who had called. Mrs. Greenwood tried to walk out of her room to see who had entered the house, but as she did, she heard a loud and terrifying scream. Despite being overcome by fear, she shouted out to Sarah Jane. As she did, she heard another scream, although this time it was not as loud. Then everything went eerily quiet. By now, Mrs. Greenwood was quite afraid, but she tried to make her way downstairs, shouting out, "Murder! Murder!" as she went. Fortunately, her neighbour, a lady named Mrs. Elsa Cadman, had also heard the screams and quickly came over to the house to see what was happening. She arrived just as Mrs. Greenwood had managed to reach the front door. It was cold and dark outside, and both ladies were quite fearful that there may have been an intruder inside the house. Nevertheless, they went into the kitchen, where they saw the horrifying sights of young Miss Sarah Jane Roberts, lying motionless on the floor. Blood was coming from her head. Mrs. Greenwood called out her name, but there was no response, although she did notice that Sarah Jane murmured something. Mrs. Cadman then went outside to fetch help. Mr. Pinder, the surgeon, soon arrived. He cradled Sarah Jane's head in his arms, but she was too weak to say anything, and just a few moments later, she died. Superintendent Bent took charge of the investigation. Mr. Greenwood told him that Sarah Jane had been employed in his house for nearly a year and was a very kind-hearted person. Neither he or his wife believed that the young lady was involved with any particular suitor and could not understand why anyone would murder her. The police wondered what could have been the motive for this most brutal attack. The mysterious Mr. W. Wilson seemed to be the most likely suspect. The superintendent surmised that the letter had been delivered in order that Mr. Greenwood leave the property, meaning that Sarah Jane would be alone with Mrs. Greenwood, who was not in good health and rarely ventured downstairs. But this theory would mean that the murder had been premeditated, so why would someone go to all this trouble to murder the young housekeeper? Rumours and speculations soon spread, and different theories emerged as to who could have committed this terrible crime. A post-mortem was conducted and concluded that Sarah Jane had died from blows to the head. Her skull had been fractured in a number of places, and her hands and arms were bruised, as she had valiantly attempted to defend herself. Somewhat bizarrely, it was ordered that photographs were taken of Sarah Jane's eyes and examined under a microscope to see if there may be an impression of the murderer. Some people thought that there was a possibility that the final thing that a person saw before they died may be retained in their eye. Despite the best attempts of the coroner and the police, they were unable to make out any such image. The funeral took place on the 10th of January, and hundreds of people lined the streets as the cortege travelled towards the church. Sarah Jane's mother Elizabeth was in attendance, as were two of her brothers and her sister. Mr. Greenwood covered all the expenses. Following the funeral, pressure mounted on the police to solve this most brutal and seemingly unprovoked attack. Sarah Jane's sister told the officer that she had received a letter in which Sarah Jane had informed her that two gentlemen had made her a proposal of marriage, one who was earning £3 a week, but Sarah Jane had decided that she would not meet either of them again. It was suggested that the young housekeeper may have had a male companion who for some unknown reason had wanted to rid himself of her. However, the autopsy had shown that Sarah Jane had never been intimate with anyone. This theory was also dismissed by Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood and by Sarah Jane's previous employers, a respectable couple named Mr. and Mrs. Williams. Mr. Williams told the officers that neither himself or his wife had ever known her to have a sweetheart. In fact, her demeanour was always very modest, and she usually gave the impression that she did not want young gentlemen trying to make her acquaintance. Sarah Jane often received letters, and it was known that some of these were from potential suitors. However, when the police searched her room for these letters, they were nowhere to be found. The police concluded that for some reason she had destroyed them. Most people believed that the young housemaid must have known her killer, as she had let the person or persons into the house. There were those who also speculated that perhaps it was a burglary that had gone horribly wrong, although there had been nothing actually taken from the property. The police had very little to go on. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and no obvious motive or suspect. All they had was a letter from the mysterious Mr. W. Wilson. Going over all of the events of the day, the police recounted that Mrs. Greenwood had been in her room, and shortly after Mr. Greenwood had gone out, Sarah Jane went to the room to help Mrs. Greenwood dress. However, she did not help her down the stairs. Instead, she told Mrs. Greenwood that she had things to attend to in the kitchen. Was she expecting a visitor, so made an excuse to return to the kitchen, or did she feel that she should tidy up before Mr. Greenwood returned, and had no idea that anyone would be calling? Sarah Jane had been downstairs for 10 minutes, prior to Mrs. Greenwood hearing the door open. It was then silent for a short time, until Mrs. Greenwood heard the kitchen door close, followed by the screams. The only caller that they knew had come by was the milkman James Parlington, but he had been seen by several witnesses continuing with his rounds, so even though he confessed to being a great admirer of Sarah Jane, he was dismissed as a potential suspect. The inquest had returned a verdict of willful murder by a person or persons unknown. With no leads and no motive, rumours about who may have committed the crime spread throughout the city, and it seemed that no one was above suspicion. The letter, written by the unknown Mr. W. Wilson, was copied and circulated throughout the area in the hope that someone would be able to recognise the handwriting. Unfortunately, no one could. A reward was also offered for information that could lead to an arrest and a conviction. On Monday, the 26th of January 1880, the newspaper, the Leeds Mercury, reported a breakthrough in the case. 2 men had been arrested 280 miles away in the coastal town of Plymouth. Their names were Robert Heald and Thomas Laylock, although it was later determined that Robert Heald's real name was Thomas Waite. The men had been staying in a lodging house in Plymouth, and the landlady had told the local police that she had read about the crime in the newspapers, and knowing that the men had come from Manchester, wondered if they were the men responsible for the brutal murder of Miss Sarah Jane Roberts. Mr. Heald, or Thomas Waite, had asked her if she would wash a pair of trousers and a shirt for him. She said that they were both stained, but she could not be certain if the stains were blood. This gentleman had worked in Manchester as a coal dealer and had travelled to Plymouth as he planned to emigrate to Australia. He had also been wanted in Manchester on charges of perjury. 2 policemen arrived in Plymouth from Harperhay and arrested the 2 men. Witnesses then confirmed that they had seen them both in the neighbourhood where the murder of Miss Sarah Jane Roberts was committed. The police found that the handwriting on the letters that Thomas Waite had on his person were very similar to the handwriting on the letter that Mr. Greenwood had received from the mysterious Mr. W. Wilson. Mr. Waite was also known to Mr. Greenwood's business partner, Mr. Cooper. Both Mr. Waite and Mr. Laylock had strangely left Manchester shortly after the murder. Mr. Waite had lived for some time in Harperhay, but strangely under the name of Thomas Hales. He was married with a child and seemed to be planning to abandon the pair in order to travel to Australia. Despite the best efforts of the police, they were unable to produce enough evidence on either man to be able to charge them with murder. Mrs. Mary Ann Greenwood never recovered from the events that took place in her house on the 7th of January 1880 and died shortly afterwards. Her husband, Mr. Richard Greenwood, left Harperhay and went to live with friends. A public collection raised more than £50, which enabled a red marble headstone to be placed beside Sarah Jane's grave. It reads, "In memory of Sarah Jane Roberts, daughter of Hugh and Elizabeth Roberts of Merlin's Cross in the parish of St. Michael's, Pembroke. Born March the 1st, 1862. Met her death by an unknown hand, January the 7th, 1880. To this day, the case remains unsolved, and the writer of the mysterious letter unknown." Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.